Welcome back after the coffee break. Welcome back to this room here and welcome back to YouTube as well. My name is Carsten Fitz. I'm Professor of American Studies, Culture and Media Studies at the University of Passau. And I was reminded to remind the YouTube audience that you can, in the Q&A, kind of cast your answers on the Slido again. That's not yet on the wall, but it should be available. And the password is hashtag BAA2025. Now it's there, but you have still some time because the talk is first, right? So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's keynote speaker to you. Sherry Lee Linkon is a professor of English, Writing, and American Studies at Georgetown University. Trained in American Studies, her research and teaching cover a wide range of fields, including American literature and culture, interdisciplinary teaching and learning, working class studies, and writing studies. And what brings her here, of course, is her great expertise in the field of working class studies. We'll see that in a moment, I'm pretty sure. From 1997 to 2012, she was co-director of the Center of Working Class Studies at Youngstown State University, Ohio, where she also directed the American Studies program, and with Youngstown, by the way, itself being a prime example for a deindustrialized city, which will be the core focus, or is the core focus of her work. From 2012 to 2022, she was the director of the Georgetown University Writing Program. Her most recent book, The Half-Life of Deindustrialization, Working Class Writing About Economic Restructuring, 2018, University of Michigan Press, examines contemporary American working class literature and media. And I will elaborate on that book in a brief moment, but I'll be diving into her other publications and activities for a short moment here. With John Russo, she co-authored Steeltown USA, Work and Memory in Youngstown, University Press of Kansas, and co-edited New Working Class Studies, Cornell University Press, 2005. She was the founding president of the Working Class Studies Association and the co-editor for some 15 years of the blog Working Class Perspectives. She's currently co-investigator with the International Research Network Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time, studying race, gender, and representations of deindustrialization in the US. And the good thing she told us this morning, the money is coming through Canada, so it's sort of safe, right? So let me dwell a little bit on the half-life of deindustrialization. Starting in the late 1970s, tens of thousands of American industrial workers lost jobs in factories and mines. Deindustrialization had dramatic effects on those workers and their communities, but its long-term effects continue to have their impact on working class culture. And it is this aspect which Lincoln calls the half-life of deindustrialization that is at the heart of this very insightful study. Economic restructuring changed the experience of work, disrupted people's sense of self, reshaped local landscapes, and redefined community identities and expectations. Through it all, working class writers have told stories that reflect the importance of memory and the struggle to imagine a different future. These stories make clear that the social costs of deindustrialization affect not only those who lost their jobs, but also their children, their communities, and American culture per se. And I think the talk yesterday by Mary Ann Trasciatti has shown that wonderfully with regard to the triangle fire. Thus, through an analysis of poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, film, and drama, this book, The Half-Life of Deindustrialization, shows why people and communities cannot simply just get over it and move on with their lives, as Lincoln writes in her introduction. As one reviewer points out, it is exactly the book we need right now to help understand the cultural and political fractures of this new Gilded Age, And that was in 2018, but is even more true today, right? Six years later. And when I read Gilded Age, I immediately think of the inside of the Trump Tower, of course, right? Linkon analyzes dozens of texts which he argues constitute a distinct genre, namely deindustrialization literature. Many of these investigated texts are actually written by children and grandchildren of industrial workers and focus on how they deal with the landscape of ruin, casualized service labor, and the legacies of class solidarity, and provide hope for change, but seem inapplicable to present-day circumstances. So the past provides inspiration and strength for working-class people, even as the contrast between past and present highlights what has been lost in the service economy. The memory of productive labor and stable, proud working-class communities shapes, so the argument goes, how people respond to contemporary economic, social, and political issues. When Linkon identifies a reflective nostalgia in her first chapter on work and memory, I was fondly reminded of my own upbringing as a working-class child sitting on my dad's back at May Day parades. Actually, these are the first parades that I have an active memory of, and they are part of our family lore. So I was really reminded of how, to the heart and how true this is, what has been addressed here in this book. My parents had just moved from the Ruhr area, by the way, to the north. My father had worked in the coal mines there, and Volkswagen was the new, employer that attracted workers to come and build a new life. So there's a lot of that, I can relate to. On a more scholarly level, when I read the title of Professor Linkon's book, I had to immediately think of J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, and I wondered into which of your four chapter, categories it would actually fit. Maybe it would fit in a fifth chapter, and this is inspired by the introductory words by Knut Detlefsen yesterday, who said, workers following false friends. Maybe that would be the chapter in which Vance's book would fit. Anyway, let me quote in summary what this reviewer from UC Berkeley has to say about the half-life of deindustrialization. This is an innovative study that introduces the reader to an incredibly diverse body of literature and art and analyzes it in a nuanced and meaningful way. It does valuable work in bringing together the study of industrial labor and deindustrialization with that of contemporary service work and neoliberalism, and will help us all to navigate through the half-life of deindustrialization in the years to come, unquote. How true, and even more so in the light of the current political situation. As my brief remarks show, for more than 25 years, Professor Linkon has been diligently researching American working class culture. Given the topic of our annual BAA conference, labor, unions, and the future of work, it would be difficult to find a scholar better suited to speak to us in a lecture about the topic from a literary perspective, I assume. And in light of what the big, beautiful bill that just went to Congress can and probably will do to the working class, I guess Professor Linkon's expertise will indeed remain in high demand in the years ahead of us, I'm afraid. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sherry Ann Linkon.
Thank you, Karsten, for the amazing introduction. People keep telling me all day, oh, I'm so looking forward to your talk, and I keep thinking the pressure is rising and rising and rising. But I want you to have high expectations. I want, of course, to thank the organizers of the conference and all of you for coming. I particularly want to thank the previous panel, because I think you set me up very nicely. That's very helpful. This has really been a lovely opportunity, and I'm looking forward to more conversations with people. I do want to make one other comment before I start, which is that if you are watching online, whether live right now or later, You are going to see some slightly different slides. I did not have permission to broadcast some of the images, so occasionally you're going to get a box that has a description of what's in the image. I'm sorry about that. If you want to reach out to me privately, I can share some of those things with you. You can also find the website for LaToya Ruby Frazier, who's one of the people whose work I'm going to talk about, and some of what is limited a little bit here. It does seem to me that talking about deindustrialization might seem counter to this conference. Labor, unions, and the future of work. Deindustrialization is about the loss of labor. It's in part about the limitations of what unions could do to protect workers, and it's about the past of work. But I think all of that is very much relevant to what we're doing. So Karsten did some of this for me, so now I get to move very quickly to talk a little bit about this concept of the half-life of deindustrialization, because I think it's part of what makes a conversation about deindustrialization useful for us as we think about the future of work. The half-life of deindustrialization is about this notion that there are toxic effects of deindustrialization that continue long after plants and mills and mines shut down. Some of that is literal toxins, environmental toxins. You'll hear a little bit about that today. But a lot of it is what we might think of as social toxins. The harms to people, not only from the loss of a job, but from the experience of having lost a job and the experience of having your father or mother lose a job, the experience of growing up in a community where the economy is very limited. The other part of the spread of those toxins is that they don't affect just workers. I think one of the key things I hope you'll hear in my presentation is that thinking about work and unions and the future of work should never be just about workers, but that the effects of those things spread through families and communities. So you'll hear me talk only a little bit about people who are what we would normally call workers when we hear the term labor, and very much about the other people around them in the communities in which they live. So I think all of that is really important. I think understanding the power of the memory of industrial labor is crucial if we're going to think about the future of work and understand that what used to be continues to shape how people think work ought to be, what they think their expectations should be, and the fears and anxieties that they bring to the workplace. So I think all of that resonates through this. Two other things that I think are important here. One is about inclusion. When I started this work, I've been working on Black women's representations of deindustrialization for about 2.5 years. When I first started it, I thought, well, I don't have to tell people that inclusion matters. The only thing that I have to say about inclusion mattering is that those of us who study deindustrialization have not paid enough attention to Black women. 6 months into Trump 2, the things we have to say about inclusion are a little bit more dramatic, and I think the importance of this work becomes even more visible. We have not, however, in deindustrialization studies, talked much about Black women. I did a quick and dirty bit of research at my university library. In their database, I found a little bit over 800 books and articles that talk about deindustrialization in the United States. When I added African American, which is the standard search term, it was around 100, and when I added women, it was 30. So there's work to be done. My very casual research has been backed up by a much more systematic review by my colleagues Marianne Fontaine and James Rhodes in an article that's coming out next year, where they've basically documented that research on Black experiences in deindustrialization remain rare, in part because we treat white workers, and mostly white men, as the standard, and assume that they are the ones who have been uniquely disadvantaged and the most hurt by the processes of decline. I want to push back on that a bit and really focus our attention elsewhere. And then finally, I want to highlight the idea that representations, and creative representations in particular, matter. We're going to be focusing today on plays and photography projects. I think those forms of storytelling are really important. They stand alongside the kinds of sociological work that we were hearing about in some of the presentations in the previous panel, because they take us inside the experience. Creative representations are inherently subjective, and they give us the opportunity to get a sense of what did this thing mean to the people who lived through it. Those of you who are historians have probably read the work of Alessandro Portelli, talking about oral history as a source that doesn't tell us what happened. It tells us what people think happened, what they wish had happened, what they wish they had done, and what they think it means now. And I think the same is true for creative representations. They help us understand how people think about these things. And that's really what I want to focus on. So we're going to talk today about 6 examples of representations of deindustrialization by Black women, all set in and people coming from deindustrialized communities. 3 plays by 3 different women, and 3 photographic projects all headed by 1 woman. In that work, I want to highlight 3 key themes. The first, entirely not surprising, is that the past shapes how we encounter the present. And that, in turn, of course, will shape our expectations for the future. Most notably, and Karsten's introduction really kind of teed this up for me nicely, there's a real difference between how most of the white artists and writers whose work I've studied talk about deindustrialization and how Black women do. And that is the difference of nostalgia. So many of the white writers, be they scholars or fiction writers or poets or filmmakers, view industrial work and its loss through the lens of nostalgia, and that is largely absent from the work by Black women, and we'll talk a little bit about why. Second, I want to focus on the notion of resisting erasure, the title of my talk, Against Erasure. And this goes back to, I want to borrow some language, I guess, from LaToya Ruby Frazier, who they had a great retrospective of her work at the Museum of Modern Art last summer, and they held a day-long scholars thing. And this is what she said in that about her work in resisting erasure. She started by telling the story of how she had found a book on the history of Braddock, Pennsylvania, where she grew up, that was just announced as a history of Braddock. And it went through and it talked about the contributions of all of these different immigrant groups. And there was not a single word said about Black workers in the Black community. And she said, I need to fight back on that. So she says that she views her work as an active resistance against the omission, erasure, invisibility, and silence surrounding African American contributions to the grand American narrative. It is incumbent upon me to resist, 1 photograph at a time, 1 photo essay at a time, 1 body of work at a time, 1 book at a time, 1 worker's monument at a time. In the aftermath of Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Morgan, Ford, and Rockefeller's deindustrialized landscapes, there are women, there are Black women, insisting on their livelihood and survival, the survival of their families, through care, love, and mutual aid, despite the slow violence of environmental degradation, pollution, toxicity, and man-made disasters. More specifically, this work makes a particular move that I want to draw our attention to, and you'll hear me talk about as we go through all of these, that they not only are resisting the erasure of Black lives, they're resisting the version of the story that says Black history, and Black working class history especially, is only about oppression and exclusion. They offer alongside that a sort of counter-narrative that focuses on community, creativity, and agency. Now, I want to highlight that that's the narrative that they're telling. My argument is not that we can, from their work, say that's the way things really were. Rather, I think it's important to understand that that story mattered to them quite a lot, and that that's a key element of what they see in the version of the story that they want to tell. So that there is both oppression and agency, and we see both of those things. So at the very end, I'll say a couple of words about why I think all of this might be useful to us as we look to the future. But I want to start by going back to the past with a very quick, very oversimplified, do not hold me to this as all of my knowledge of history, review of the history of race and class and labor in the US, just to have all of this fresh in our minds. We have to start with the idea of slavery as a foundational formation in American culture, establishing conflict not only between the white upper class and black enslaved people, but within the working class, and a division between workers. We see it in the history of how slavery operated, the use of white men as overseers, their involvement in things like hunting down people who had escaped from slavery. We also see it in the North, where there are battles over who has the right to jobs, happening at the same time as slavery, but again, that notion that there's a competition for who has the right to jobs. Historian David Roediger famously talks about this as the wages of whiteness. The notion that white workers were offered, somebody used the term earlier, kind of compensatory status, a compensatory social wage, if you will, for being white. That is, the idea that they were superior and better, and that they had a right to those jobs that black people did not have. And that sets up a division that gets carried out through much of the history of American labor, and as the papers from the last session make clear, that is still going on. We have not really ever moved fully beyond that, and certainly American politics right now make very clear that all of this is still going on. The Great Migration provided an escape. Part of why people left was to escape the violence of Jim Crow, the rise of the KKK, though they found the KKK in industrial cities in the North frequently. But unions, when people came north to go work in places like steel mills and auto plants, unions did not at first welcome either immigrants or migrants into their ranks. And in fact, part of the work of the KKK in northern places like Youngstown, Ohio, where they ran local government for a good part of the 1920s, was to keep out immigrants and to control that part of work. Black workers were excluded and treated unfairly, often within American labor unions as well as within the workplace. After World War I and World War II, the government put into place some programs designed to help soldiers coming back begin to improve their lives, especially after World War II. Things like the GI Bill that enabled some people to go to college, supports for home ownership, basically for home loans, helped white former soldiers and white working class people begin to move into the suburbs. Many of those programs were limited so that black people could not take advantage of them. That includes employment practices, union contracts, and all of these government programs. Black people had much less access to that. And what that meant is that they continued to lag behind in terms of their economic position, their job security, the kinds of jobs that they could do in places like steel mills and auto plants for quite a long while. One of the effects of the civil rights movement was not only the passage of equal opportunity employment laws, but in 1974, a consent decree that required both the steel industry and the steel union to change their practices to give women and black workers better access to higher level jobs and better pay. The date of that is very important, 1974. It's 1977 when the steel industry in the United States begins to contract and they start to lay off a lot of people. So what that tells us is that black workers didn't have enough time after that consent decree was passed to really benefit from those changes before things started to shut down. Making sure that one other thing to say about the consent decree. And this comes from the work of Jill Shenham, an anthropologist who just published a book on the steel industry in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And part of what she found is that, not surprising at all, some of the advantages that the consent decree brought for black workers generated more racism and more resistance among white workers, so that we had those continued divisions carried on for quite a while. What that meant is that black workers and women benefited much less from those changes, and that when deindustrialization hit, they were harmed much more. So Joe Trotter and Jared Ende have written about this in Pittsburgh. They write that after the decline of the steel industry there, rates of unemployment, depression, juvenile delinquency, interventions by child protective services, and incarceration were all higher for blacks in the area than they were for whites. While wages in the jobs that laid-off steel workers were able to get were much lower than what they had been earning in the mills, and that, of course, was even more so for black workers. I want us not to forget, however, another couple of chapters in black history. One is about black activism, and remembering that there were many examples, people in the last panel talked about a couple of them, many examples of black workers organizing, sometimes within unions, sometimes against unions. DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement in Detroit, is one example of that, which is where this poster comes from. So it was not as if black workers were just sitting around waiting for everything to change. They were very active in doing that. I think it's also important to understand, and this is part of that counter-narrative that I'm going to talk more about, that black agency and mutuality also existed. In many northern cities where people had gone from the Great Migration to come north to find jobs, they created micro-economies with black businesses where people served the rest of the black community, supported, of course, by the wages of people working in industry, but really kind of a do-it-yourself form of economy. The historian Michelle S. Johnson describes the black community in Saginaw, Michigan, where a lot of her family migrated to, talking about this relationship between the industrial workers and the rest of the economy. So she says that her family would describe their hometown by saying that, yes, there were a lot of men who were working in the auto plants, but black people also owned and frequented 24 hours. Oh, I thought I had the quote up there. I don't. You just have to listen carefully. Sorry. Black people owned and frequented 24-hour soul food restaurants, grocery stores, a tailor shop, barber and beauty shops, a drugstore, a fish market, ice cream parlors, cleaners and a pool hall, a beer garden, a dance hall, bars, and a recreation establishment deemed a baby casino by my Uncle Raleigh. I think this list emphasizes that vision of self-sufficiency and entrepreneurship, a key part of the counter-narrative of black agency, that reminds us that there was a pushback against the ways that people's lives were limited by stepping up and kind of building some of their own. Finally, I think it's important to remember that black arts have been an important version of creative labor going back almost to all of history, and have been a critical take on what's going on. So the Black Deindustrial Imaginary that I'm going to talk about is part of a very long tradition of storytelling and arts as a form of resistance. So I want to start by talking about these three plays. Interestingly, they all were written and produced between 2015 and 2022, so a fairly short period, most of it during the first Trump administration. Lynn Nottage's play Sweat was the first of three projects she developed based on interviews with residents of Reading, Pennsylvania in 2012. Sweat was the first of the pieces that she developed from that research, and I'll say briefly, she started that research because she got a letter from a friend who had been laid off from her job and was struggling to make rent. And she started thinking about poverty, and she looked up, she said, Reading, Pennsylvania is the city in the country that has the highest poverty levels. I'm going to go talk to people there. And so she went and interviewed people. From that, she created two plays and a multimedia performance project. I'm going to focus on Sweat, which was first performed at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2015, at Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. in 2016, and then on Broadway in 2017, and it went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama that year. Dominique Morisseau's Skeleton Crew is also part of a trilogy. In this case, she wrote three plays about people in Detroit, mostly about black life in Detroit, one set in the 1940s, one set in the 1960s, and one set in the early 2000s. Skeleton Crew is the one set in the early 2000s. It opened off Broadway in 2016 and was later staged at the Detroit Public Theater. The most recent of the plays is Erica Dickerson Dispenza's play Colored Water, which is set in Flint, Michigan, amid that city's water crisis, which began in 2014. It was first staged in Chicago in 2018. It had a workshop production at the Public Studio in New York in 2019, and then it ran off Broadway at the Public Theater in 2021, and it's been traveling around the country and being produced in various places ever since. While deindustrialization is a central theme in each of these plays, it's an influence on conditions of community and family life, as well as an immediate threat to characters who are worried about layoffs. It's anxieties about the loss of work that prompt conversations among characters about what their jobs in steel and automaking mean to them and their families, including the contested history of work and unions for Black workers. In Morrison's Skeleton Crew, Faye is the oldest of 4 Black auto workers who are meeting daily before and after their shift in the break room at their auto factory. They're facing downsizing and possible closure, and Faye serves as the group's historian. As she tells one of her younger colleagues, she's worked in the plant so long that I know everything about this place. The walls talk to me. The dust on the floors write me messages. I'm in the vents. I'm in the bulletin boards. I'm in the chipped paint. She also reminds the younger workers of the history of Black exclusion. When one complains about the cost of union dues, Faye tells him, "Was the time you wasn't even allowed in the union, dummy. Wasn't nothing but the mule of the industry doing the shittiest labor you could think of. And now here you are, choosing your trade and thinking you got that shit all by yourself." I should apologize. There will be a fair amount of cussing in this talk. I'm just quoting the writers. At the end of the play, Faye, as the senior person, quits. Their layoffs are threatened, and she decides to leave, giving up her 30-year pension by quitting a week before she hits the 30-year mark in order to protect the jobs of her fellow workers. Dickerson Dispenza's Colored Water centers on a family of Black women struggling with the effects of water contamination. But the play makes clear that their struggles are linked with the history of industry, labor, and racial discrimination in Flint. The family at the heart of the play has a 3-generation history of working for GM, a history that includes labor unrest, physical injuries, and a promise from a manager that members of their family would always have a place at GM. However, as conversations among the women reveal, that promise came in response to racial violence. As one explains, the first family member to work at GM was lynched at the plant after leading a fight for better wages for Black workers. Papa slaved away in that Buick foundry for less than $1 an hour, and when he agitated for higher wages, the GM clan tied him up like a hog and set him on fire. That pattern repeated when his daughter, Big Ma, returned to them same plantation working conditions after a later strike, and is injured when a stack of sheet metal just happens to fall on her leg. For this family, GM has been at once a source of economic stability, but also a site of danger and exclusion. And the union has not protected them. Indeed, as Big Ma comments when her daughter Marion expresses worries that she's going to lose her job at GM, Big Ma reminds her that she can't count on the union to defend her job. We know what side them UAW reps is on, and it ain't ours. Both Skeleton Crew and Colored Water take us into conversations among Black workers about their shared history of discrimination on the job. Nottage's Sweat, however, suggests the possibility and the limitations of cross-racial solidarity. It focuses on a long-standing friendship between 3 women, 2 white and 1 Black, and 2 of their sons, 1 white, the other Black, who gather regularly at the bar after work. The 3 women bonded because they were among the first women to land jobs in the mill after the consent decree. But that bond is challenged when a supervisory position opens up and 2 of the women apply. The racial divisions that lie just below the surface of solidarity emerge as each woman talks about her own and her family's history of work, telling stories that underscore the contrast between white nostalgia and Black struggle. Tracy, the white daughter of a master carpenter, recalls her family's proud legacy of craft and industrial labor. In contrast, Cynthia remembers how she and other Black workers had to fight, not only to be hired, but also to be allowed in the union. Nottage develops that theme through stories from 2 minor characters, using those stories to make clear that conflict over access to work and union representation does not divide neatly on a white-Black binary. Cynthia's ex-husband, Bruce, complains about some Spanish cats crossing the picket line at his plant, but moments later, he recalls a white union member talking about how we took his job and claiming that when Black workers came to Reading, they ruined everything. Later in the play, Oscar, a Colombian American who works at the bar, takes a temporary job at the steel mill when the others are locked out. He justifies his decision by telling the story of his father's thwarted hopes. navigating slides in paper, about his father's thwarted hopes of getting a job in the steel mill. He said the only position he could get was sweeping floors. And those fuckos wouldn't even give him a union card. But he wanted a job in the steel factory. It was the American way. So he swept fucking floors thinking one day they'll let me in. Instead of recognizing the commonality in these patterns of discrimination and resentment, the white and black workers at the bar turn on Oscar when they learn that he has taken the job at the mill during the lockout. They unite in fury to beat him up. In the shifting loyalties and conflicts of Sweat, Nottage highlights both the possibility of solidarity and the persistence of racial division. As all of this suggests, the plays link the past with the present, often connecting the history of racial exclusion with the possibility of advancement. All three of the plays feature a black character moving into a supervisory role, and in all three that opportunity is at once hopeful and problematic. In Morisot's Skeleton Crew, Reggie is a black man who's been promoted to supervisor, and he talks about what that allows for his family. He's saving to put his daughter through college, and he just bought that house in Sherwood. Couldn't hardly believe we could afford it, but we got it. It's ours. I own something that can't nobody take away from me. That means something. Yet one of the younger workers sees Reggie as a traitor for working on the management side and challenges him for acting like you ain't come up here in the same way the rest of us did. The color of that collar don't change your origins. Meanwhile, Reggie worries that his passion in standing up for other black workers will make his boss dismiss him as an out-of-control, angry black man. In Sweat, Cynthia is promoted to supervisor over her white friend Tracy, but when the company locks workers out, she's caught between management and her friends. And she worries that she's been promoted because the company knew that having a black woman enforce the lockout would foster division among the workers. In Colored Water, Marion is promoted while others are being laid off, but here that generates conflict with her family and within herself. What is the best way for her to protect her family, she wonders. Should she accept a promotion to a job that would pay her enough to buy an industrial-strength water filter to protect her family's health and to cover the medical bills of her 9-year-old daughter whose leukemia has been linked with the city's contaminated water? Or should she stand with her family and her community by signing on to a class action suit that is against both the city and GM, whose wastewater practices have contributed to the contamination? Does fighting back for her family put her job at risk? By linking the history of racial discrimination in industrial work to the constraints and conflicts that accompany promotions, these plays suggest the limits of modest advancement within the corporate workplace. These plays also point to some alternatives, and we turn back then to the counter-narrative just very briefly here. In two of the plays, there are characters who see education as a path out of industrial work and towards a more meaningful and independent work life. The black son in Nottage's Sweat is preparing to go to college to become a teacher, while one of the younger women in the family in Dickerson Dispenza's Colored Water, it's raining? Is that what we're hearing? Okay, sorry. It's the water. One of the younger daughters in Colored Water is training to be a doula. In Skeleton Crew, one of the younger auto workers is planning to open his own body shop, using the skills he gained on the job to create a more independent position. Colored Water also suggests a more active form of resistance as the family members become involved in protests and the class action suit. While none of these storylines is fully developed, they suggest a central theme of that counter-narrative of the Black deindustrialization story, envisioning alternative, independent, often creative or caring economic paths. Like Johnson's description of Black commercial life in Saginaw, this DIY strategy has its own long history that is connected with the history of industrial labor and its loss. That theme is central to LaToya Ruby Frazier's multiple projects that focus on Black women's lives in deindustrialized communities. While Frazier incorporates the industrial and deindustrial past, her work doesn't just add Black lives to that history. She resists erasure by offering a counter-narrative that emphasizes creative agency, collaboration, and activism. Frazier's first major project, The Notion of Family, was inspired in part by that local history book that I talked about earlier. she decided that she would address the gap by creating a book about her family and about her community. The book combines interior domestic scenes and portraits of herself, her mother, her grandmother, and some other family members, with exterior shots that position the family in relation to the history of Braddock and its deindustrialized present. There are 4 themes that emerge in this project. The first is defining Frazier and her family as being rooted in and shaped by the industrial history of their community. It starts with a small booklet that's actually bound into the title page of the book that begins with an image of John Frazier, who was the first white person to settle in Braddock, a man of Scottish heritage. It ends with an image of Andrew Carnegie. You know who he is. And in between, there's an image of LaToya Ruby Frazier as a small child wearing a white dress. And it's just these 3 pages, even before we get into the heart of the book. What follows for the first about 15 pages of the book is a kind of positioning sequence of photos. We begin with an ad from local industries welcoming us to historic Braddock. It's followed by an aerial shot of the massive Edgar Thomson works, which, by the way, were still in operation, a shot of a depopulated Main Street, as you see here, and various interior scenes of the family, including an image of her grandmother Ruby lighting a cigarette in the living room, a set of family photos sitting on a dresser, and various pictures of family members just being in the house. 2 self-portraits also appear in this part of the book. The first was taken in 2007 and shows Frazier sitting naked from the waist up, looking defiantly at the camera. The accompanying text states that she is in search of a new space, place, and time. Where are my geographers? The second, which comes at the end of this process, is taken 2 years later, and it shows Frazier, same pose, now wearing the black tank top. But the text on the other side, which I know you can't read, I can't even read that, but I wanted you to see how the book gets laid out so you can get a sense of the relationship between the text and the image. What those little teeny tiny words say is this: a descendant of Scottish, African, Bradonian, blue-collar steelworkers, I embrace my heritage. This opening sequence insists that we cannot see Frazier or her family as separate from the industrial work that formed the center of that community, but neither can we see that work as the sole source of meaning or identity for this black family. In addition to the toxicity of the steel industry, let me try that again. The second theme that Frazier talks about is the toxicity of the steel industry and its effects on the lives of this family. She shows us images and commentaries of herself, her mother, and her grandmother, all dealing with illnesses that reflect the physical, economic, and social harms rooted in the toxins left over from industrial manufacturing. A full-page spread, this one, again, you can't read that tiny text, but trust me, it's simply a list of different chemicals that were released by the steel mills and that have been found in testing in the soil and water in Braddock. It stands across from this image. This is actually another image of Frazier, kind of leaning on the sink, and the comment talks about the effects of those chemicals on things like the autoimmune illnesses such as lupus, which she herself has. So we get it linked to her own illness and to those chemicals. As art historian Amber Wiley argues, Frazier's work reveals the interconnected and sometimes hidden scales of deindustrialization's half-life, from the cell, through the body, to the family, to the home, and the community. And we'll see all of those scales. If we had time to go through this book in great detail, you'd see every bit of that. We don't. Third theme in this is critiquing the continued social injuries of deindustrialization as represented in the closing of the local hospital. There's a final sequence of the book that is really all about that closing. Frazier highlights the effects of the closing of the hospital by locating it and connecting it to the community. So she pairs this image with a text that talks about what does the hospital do for the community. Here's her list. It's a historic hospital building, a community center, a cafeteria, and a restaurant. In fact, the only restaurant in the town of Braddock at the time that it was torn down. It has 123 licensed beds, 652 employees, 277,000 square feet, in a facility that also offers behavioral health, drug and alcohol detox, and a rehabilitation program. To underscore the human costs, she intersperses this with intimate images of family members. The close-up of one person's swollen feet, Grandma Ruby standing outside of the hospital, and then another of her in a hospital bed. We see Frazier's mother, again, leaning on a bathroom sink. I don't know what the thing is with the sink. Her bra pulled down around her waist to expose scars from a recent but unspecified injury, a look of pain and worry on her face. Frazier frames the problems of the healthcare system in explicitly gendered and raced terms, noting that it fails to provide relief or aid for Black women living below the poverty line. She describes how her mother was tired of waiting in emergency rooms and of being told by UPMC doctors that her symptoms are psychological. Knowing that UPMC is the people who operated the hospital, that UPMC won't help her, she stays inside, becoming a prisoner in her own home. Finally, Frazier presents the home and family relations as a site of care, mutuality, and creativity, a place where people are constructing their own ways of doing things and their own images. A particularly striking image in this part is a two-page spread featuring the photo of Grandma Ruby wiping Gramps. Gramps is Grandma Ruby's stepfather, which highlights how the effects of industrial labor extended into intimate spaces and interactions of reproductive labor. While the image focuses on Grandma Ruby, the text on the facing page tells Gramps' story. Frazier recalls her childhood interactions with him. He always wore his suit and bow tie with a fedora, suspenders, and alligator shoes. He would greet her warmly, saying, "Hello, doll," and offering her a napkin filled with sugar-coated orange slices and Snickers. The text moves from the family outward, going on to talk about the work that Gramps did as a steelworker at the Edgar Thomson Works and as a lifelong Republican. I'm happy for those of you who don't understand why he would be a Republican, ask me in the questions later. Frazier describes how he and other Black workers were relegated to, quote, hard labor in high temperatures, tearing down and rebuilding furnaces, cleaning up spilt metal and slag. When he couldn't work anymore, Frazier adds, Gramps was easily forgotten. Once hard labor consumed his body, it was discarded and thrown away. Together, the image and the text suggest that Grandma Ruby's caregiving is personal care, but also the result of political and economic conditions. The image also complicates our understanding of the home, not only as a site of reproductive labor, but also as a place where family relationships and individual dignity were nurtured. Home was where Gramps put on his suit and bow tie, and it was where he was cared for when his body dealt with the injuries of steelwork and the deprivations of its loss. Frazier's images of domestic activities suggest a contested relationship between economic structures, social change, and family life, while her commentaries help us understand how industrial labor and its loss are embedded in the lives of individuals, families, and a community that is not defined solely around industrial jobs. That said, this image is actually unusual in the book in its attention to reproductive labor, which Frazier downplays in her presentation of women in her family. Only about a half a dozen images in an almost 200-page book show women engaged in typically feminine caregiving or domestic activities, nor do we see them at work in their paid service industry jobs. Frazier identifies her grandmother as having been a manager at Goodwill and her mother as being a nurse's aide, but we don't see them in those roles. Most often, Frazier shows these women and herself just being in their homes, interacting with other family members. She created many of these images in collaboration with her mother, and some of them show them in the middle of that creative process. These are actually stills from a video that they took, I think called Mom Fight, where they are wrestling with each other. Mom Wrestle is what it's called. And they're wrestling with each other in these postures that are both at once sympathetic and comforting and antagonistic. But we see them playing together, essentially. And we see their ownership, if you will, of their own image. This approach in this project defines them as complex individuals in multiple roles, embedded in relationships, in control of their own images, interconnected and yet also complete in themselves. 7 years later, 2019, Frazier collaborated with displaced steelworker and cultural worker Sandra Gould Ford on a project called Woman of Steel, Making of Steel Genesis, a multimedia exhibit at the August Wilson Center in Pittsburgh. It combined photographs taken by each of the women with documents that Ford rescued from the office where she worked as a secretary at J&L Steel, and Frazier's cyanotype prints of other images and documents. The documents record several aspects of life in the mill, including patterns of conflict and exclusion. So there are documents about injuries, there are documents about grievances, there's a document about pensions and what's going to happen in pensions. Only one of these is really explicitly about race, and it's this document, which you probably can't read, but it's part of a report on how J&L Steel responded to the consent decree. So this is from 1980, and it's telling us that out of more than 200 possible positions, only 6 are held by black workers. At the bottom of the page, the writer explicitly calls out the racism of management. We at J&L continue to have, in very high positions, people who have been bold enough to express adverse sentiments toward the hiring of the black race of people. A selection of materials from the exhibit, published in a book highlighting several of Frazier's projects, includes blueprints from the mill, interior and exterior photos of the mill, cyanotypes of murals featuring black residents of the Homewood neighborhood in Pittsburgh, and images of the abandoned mill. Together, all of this reminds us of the mill's long and sometimes troubled history, including, as in the plays and Frazier's Braddock Project, its history of racial discrimination, as well as its literally huge presence in the neighborhood of Homewood. Women of Steel also echoes that industrial work is not the sole source of identity and meaning for black workers. She does that in part. We open with the image of Sandra Gould Ford in her office at J&L Steel, but we also see images of her at home, working at her sewing machine, and Frazier's captions very clearly use the language of work. We see this image of Sandra Gould Ford working on quilts in her sewing studio. There's another of her working on her novels in her writing studio. The exhibit includes the cover of an issue of Shooting Star, a literary magazine that Ford created and edited in the 1980s, featuring work by black writers, as well as an image of her at the Homewood branch of the Carnegie Library. The Steel genesis of the title is a book of vignettes by Ford, which have since been posted on her website. Mixing all of these images with historic and present images and materials from the steel mill offers a complex portrait of Ford that connects her industrial labor with her creative work. Frazier embraces the theme of agency even more fully in this massive 3-part project on the Flint water crisis. And I mean massive, quite literally. This book that you see is this thick, hardcover, about this big, and it weighs 6 pounds. This is why I didn't bring it to share with you. I wanted to, but it was just too big. But it's really a kind of monumental, to use her word, project. Flint is Family in 3 Acts focuses on black working-class women navigating the consequences of deindustrialization in a declining automaking community. Its first act focuses on the life of a black working-class family dealing with the water crisis. The second act follows that family in a reverse migration from Flint to Mississippi, while the last act brings us back to Flint to celebrate a community project that addressed the problems of water contamination. Across those 3 acts, Flint is Family really highlights that idea of creativity and agency of black women and in a multicultural working-class community. While this project is less overtly connected with deindustrialization than the others, Frazier makes clear early on that the story of the Flint water crisis is, like the stories she has constructed about Braddock and Homewood, shaped by deindustrialization. In the book of photos and essays documenting this project, that big, massive book, Frazier begins with an essay where she highlights her shared experience with her primary collaborator, Shay Cobb, who's a writer and musician. She says, Shay and I, both born in the 1980s, lived in households with grandparents who worked in the automotive and steel industries. Our families had hopes and aspirations to provide their children and grandchildren with opportunity for upward mobility, better education, home ownership, and land. These hopes and dreams would never fully materialize, in part because of the collapse of the steel industry in the 1970s and 80s in Pennsylvania, and GM's departure from Flint in the late 1990s, as the company sought to evade environmental cleanup costs, prevent the growth of organized and unionized black workers, and find cheaper labor. That's a typo. I just read cheaper, not chapter. Sorry about that. In this statement, Frazier roots herself and Cobb in the history of the black working class and the social, economic, and environmental damages of the auto industry and its closure. The first two acts, as I said, of Flint is Family focus on this particular family, on Shay Cobb and her daughter Zion. And one of the first images shows how they were, the first act shows how they were managing the twin challenges of water contamination and economic decline. Along with this image, which is actually Shay pouring bottled water into her daughter's mouth so she can safely brush her teeth, we follow Shay through her day as she engages in several jobs. She drives a school bus, she cuts hair in her home, she edits recordings in a music studio. Her patchwork of labor highlights both the struggle to get by in a depressed economy, but also her determination and creativity in constructing a life that balances earning money with creative expression. Act 2 follows Shay and Zion to Mississippi, where Shay's father raises horses on family-owned land where his grandfather once raised cotton. That history in itself complicates the standard narrative of black labor, where in the South we think of cotton growing first as the primary labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants, and later as an element of the exploitative sharecropping system that replaced the plantation model. We very rarely hear about independent black cotton farmers, much less about black people who owned land and raised horses that are meant not only for labor, but for show. But that is the story that this book tells. Returning to the site of this family's history offers Shay and Zion not only access to clean water, but also an alternative way of life. Moving from Flint to Mississippi takes them away from the toxicity of corporate capitalism to self-sufficiency, rooted in family, expertise, and ownership. For Frazier, these two acts of the project make black working-class women's lives visible in ways that also complicate the narratives their standard narratives about struggle and victimization. She writes that she produced this story so the country could see a different truth, a different reality, one that counters Shay's life in northern industrial America. Flint is Family, this goes beyond resisting the erasure of black working class lives to contribute to this counter-narrative that positions industrial work as just one part of a broader and more agentic economic story. The final act of Flint is Family takes that even further, documenting the work of black workers together with a multicultural working class community in Flint to purchase an atmospheric water generator that would help provide clean water to the families of the mostly black Fifth Ward. This is actually a photo of Shay and Zion drinking from the hose of the clean water generator. Frazier helped raise the funds to purchase the generator by selling photographs from the exhibit that documented the first two acts of this book. So she basically used her creative work to raise the money to try to solve the problem. The generator project is a contemporary variation on the alternative community-centered microeconomies that black working class people created in many industrial cities. Instead of waiting for GM and local and state authorities to provide a solution, residents worked together to do it for themselves. Including all three acts, In Flint is Family thus produces an especially powerful monument, and the book is clearly monumental, to the history of racial struggle for black workers and to black working class resilience and solidarity. So, I'm almost done. What do these three themes that I noted earlier, engaging with the past, resisting erasure, and the counter-narrative of community and agency, offer for our thinking about labor, unions, and the future of work? I want to highlight two points. The first is that on a very basic level, inclusion means many aspects of identity. Black women's Deindustrial Imaginaries remind us that the history of work and its loss extends far beyond workers and workplaces. that we need to think about the history of labor and unions, and the future of work, for that matter, as being embedded in families and embedded in communities, and that this has a much broader effect and much broader consequences. Second, while we should neither forget nor ignore the injuries of racial exclusion and discrimination, those are very real, and these projects make them very visible, we must also attend to the ways that people create agency and solidarity for themselves, and what the stories of that agency and solidarity mean to them, how they function as a way of kind of balancing some of the limitations of focusing too much on victimization. Through work so we can do this by paying attention to work that we don't often recognize in our conversations about labor and unions. Work in small businesses, in caregiving, in mutual support, and in creative labor. Our visions for the future of labor, unions, and work will be more complete and I think more inspiring when we use all of these lenses. Thank you. Questions? Are we all too tired for questions?
Yeah, the floor is open, both for the YouTube audience who can start, as well as for the people in the room here. Questions. Thank you so much for this wonderfully inspiring talk and insight into the imaginaries from these different perspectives, and a great addition and you know, juxtaposition to your book in so many ways. Kerstin.
I don't know if this is a question. First of all, thank you so much for pointing out the power of narratives and story that we had. Because all along, while we were talking about data, and this is not meant to set off one against the other, I thought, where does the data come from? Where do all the opinions, the assertions, where do these things, these ideas come from? And they come from the stories we tell each other about each other. I have just two suggestions that I would like your views on. You talked about creative representation, and I thought it's a tiny thing, but I thought of creative interpretation. You know, you interpret it and then you reinterpret it, so you have a whole series of things, and then that creates a new network. And the other issue that came to my mind, especially when you showed the pictures, the photos of Sandra Gold Ford, it's the photograph and the caption that adds a subversive layer to it. Yes. So it's very ideological. It does ideological work or ideological labor. So it's basically, I would just like to talk to you more about these two issues. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you. It's a fabulous question, and I actually think they fit together. That is, I think part of what Frazier does in her projects is use the captions that she attaches to the photographs as an opportunity to interpret the photos and to invite us as audiences to see not just, here's an image of my grandmother standing, there are several images of her holding, she collects dolls. So there are images of her holding her dolls, for example. So this is not just a picture of an older black woman holding dolls. What does it represent? What do I want you to think about? And she's not necessarily saying, this is exactly what it means. She's often giving us a story. She's giving us a memory that goes with it, that adds those layers. I would add, too, and I think we see this perhaps most clearly in the Woman of Steel project, where Frazier has taken the documents and some of the photographs and made these cyanotypes of them. So the blueprints that echo the blueprints of the mill that also appear in that exhibit is a way of reminding us that none of these images is natural, that a photograph is not just the image of the thing that happens. It is a work of art. It is something that has been framed and chosen. And let me add one more thing to all of this, because I appreciate your point about we don't want to suggest that these kinds of interpretive, narrative, responsive, artistic work is fundamentally different from the data that we look at. One of the projects that John Russo and I did about 15 years ago was an online textbook called Reading Work, which I'm sorry to say you can no longer get. It has disappeared into the ether. But at the core of that project was the idea that we can perform an interpretive reading, a critical interpretive reading, on almost anything by asking the same set of 5 questions. Like, who made it and why? Who was it made for? Who are the original audience and how did they engage with it? What is its content? What are its signs? How is it structured? And what am I bringing to it as a member of the audience? And every chapter of the book took a different kind of representation, and we talked about, statistical reports as a representation. Somebody decided what was the appropriate data to put in there. Somebody decided how to make that graph. Why did they decide to do it that way? And what was the effect of doing it that way? So I really do see these things as all items that we can read critically, while it's also true, I think, that the storytelling of plays and photographs and novels and poems and all of that are just a little bit closer to the surface, so we can recognize them a little more easily. What else?
Thank you so much for your talk. Well, thank you. I have a couple of thank you notes. Thank you for, I really like the way how you brought in Black families, and I had to think of Bell Hooks's oppositional public sphere in homes of Black families, and it comes so beautifully through the text you selected and the photographs you selected. Also, Tina Kemp's Black Futurity, and what do we show now to make the future that will come, so how that's incorporated into photography. And the other thank you is for bringing in Flint's family in 3 acts. It's massive. I can absolutely agree on that. I have 2 very specific questions on that book, honestly. Mm-hmm. So one is, you mentioned she is the artist, and that's one part of her work, but then also so she has to come to get by other jobs. There's this really beautiful picture of her sitting at the driver's seat of the bus. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that connection. And then the other question comes back to what you just said about artworks and photographs. And there are those beautiful aerial views, aerial shots of deindustrialized landscapes, of empty plots where houses are missing, of Flint being emptied out of everything. Right. And I'm just wondering what you make of that.
Yeah. Those are great questions. First, the way that Frazier tells us Shay's story, and there's actually another artist who she includes in that too, a woman named Amber Hassan, who are both these creative workers, but who, in order to survive, have to do these other jobs. It is just, I think, in part a reminder of what the current economy is about, and all of the forms of precarity that we've talked about over the last couple of days. And the notion of putting, and I think she does this with Sandra Gould Ford as well, and in some ways with herself and her mother and her grandmother in the notion of family, the idea that those forms of work are just, I'm going to say just, and I don't mean that in a minimizing way, but that they are forms of work just like auto work or steel work or being a nurse's aide or managing a Goodwill or driving a school bus. That all of these are forms of work, and we should recognize all of them. And that all of them are in a place like Flint, or a place like Braddock, or a place like Homewood, shaped by the history of that place, and shaped by the economic changes that led to deindustrialization, and that make those places, sites where it's actually really, really hard to make a living, and lots of people are piecing things together. The point about the landscapes, I actually want to turn to, I think she's a geographer. Alice Ma has written a wonderful book called Industrial Ruins. And one of the points that she makes is that we view industrial ruins as depopulated places. And there's a whole genre of photography that often gets referred to as ruin porn, where you've probably all seen like the photographs of the inside of the abandoned Packard plant in Detroit. If you haven't seen it, you are in a very small minority because they are everywhere. And part of what Alice Moss says is, you know, we show these places as if nobody lived there, but in fact there are people living and working in those neighborhoods. And those sites are, and they're not just sites of memory for the people who used to work there. They are the day-to-day encounters of people who move through those spaces. And we need to understand that that's their life now. So I'm thinking about the very first photo I showed from the notion of work, which is just this boarded up building on a seemingly abandoned street. The caption that Frazier puts to it talks about her grandmother Ruby reminding her of what was there when she was a child, but also Frazier thinking about what she saw when she was growing up and seeing the difference between the very active, lively neighborhood and this kind of shut down place. So I think we have to be thinking in really critical ways about what deindustrialized places tell us. I guess the best way to put it. Thanks. Great question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
It is a little hard to see.
Yeah. I want to come back to a distinction that you made at the beginning of your talk, and then that seemed to be reiterated at various times. When you talk about nostalgia or the absence of nostalgia, and I think you began by saying, you know, when you look at representations of white artists or by white artists, this is a dominant discourse, this is nostalgically tinged, and that is an absence with regard to the representations by black artists. They are not nostalgic. And then you also contrasted white nostalgia to black struggle. And I wondered, would you argue that the industrialization then, in sort of the history of black struggle, is not as much a caesura than it is in the white discourse? I mean, that would be one explanation. Yeah. But maybe you have other explanations. I just would like to hear a little bit more about, you know, where do you see the, how do you say, the determining factors for this very, very strong observation? Yeah.
So this is part of the puzzle that I've been trying to solve, to figure out why does it look so different? And one of my theories that I'm always a little wary of is that industrial work meant something different to black people than it did to white people. And part of that goes back to the wages of whiteness and the idea of white industrial workers finding identity and meaning and opportunity and solidarity in that work. I don't know if any of you have read Thomas Bell's Out of This Furnace. Anybody know this novel? It's one person. It's one of my favorite of what we refer to as the proletarian novels in American culture. So from the 20s and 30s, where they talk about the formation of the union movement, but there's regularly in those novels a vision of people coming together across their differences. So for 250 pages or so in Out of This Furnace, Thomas Bell writes about these characters, these Czech immigrant characters, and their divisions with other white workers. But when they start to form the Steelworkers Organizing Collaborative in the middle of the 1930s, he has this like epiphany of solidarity, that we are all the same, and we are all going to be Americans, and we're going to get to be Americans by fighting together for this. And there's this sense of becoming a citizen. There are lots of people, when we talk about the meanings of work, one of the meanings of work is that working enables you to be a citizen. And that's embedded in that white narrative. Because so much of the story of work for black workers is a story of struggle within the workplace and with other workers, that work doesn't have that kind of validation. And it becomes, I think, a little bit more of a piece with the longer history going back to slavery. And almost, at some point, I had been kind of thinking of this notion of, it's almost like deindustrialization is just one more time I'm being displaced and one more time I'm being treated badly. And I think that might be overstatement. I go back to Joe Trotter and Jared Day's work, where they make very clear that black workers actually suffered more than their white neighbors, or they weren't their neighbors, they were living in a different neighborhood, but from their white comrades when mills shut down, because they didn't have as much. And so they suffered even more. So I think the struggle is both a repetition of the way things have been, and a particular hardship. So as you can tell, I continue to wrestle with this. I don't know exactly. I'll refer you to Lynn Nottage, the playwright, the woman who wrote Sweat, who talked about when she went to Reading, she interviewed workers of all kinds, and she said two things about the white workers that she interviewed. One, she said, you know, it hadn't occurred to me that there were white people who felt excluded from the American economy the way I did. Which I thought was just an interesting observation. But then she went on to say, you know, the thing is, white people found meaning in industrial work. Black people found their meaning in community. And I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but it's part of what got me thinking about that counter-narrative, is to try to test out, is she right about that? So I'm rambling a bit, but I think it's such a great question, and I don't fully know. I'm still trying to figure it out. I have to finish this, turn it into an article in the next couple months, so maybe I'll figure it out by then. We'll see.
I think it ties in with the discussion. With this, it ties well in with the discussion we just had. I wondered, industrial societies and deindustrialized societies have a very different notion of home, of roots, and the land. And I wonder, what is black women's take on these terms, which you actually did not use in your talk? So I wonder, are these terms absent? I don't think they are, but how are they being transformed in deindustrial societies and through black women's narratives?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I'm wary about giving an answer for all of black women's narratives. In the work that I'm seeing, I do see a lot of attention to home, much less attention to land. So of those different terms. So one of my arguments about the notion of family is that part of what Frazier is doing is rooting the story of black women in the home. The fact that we see her and her mother and her grandmother, like almost the only place we see them is in their home. And that is the center of everything. But it's not the traditional kind of feminine version of reproductive labor. The home is a place of selfhood. The home is a place of, I'm always wary to use this word, but it's almost like a place of freedom in the sense that you can be yourself there and you can make a life for yourself there. So home is very important in that sense. Land, not so much, and it's part of what I find so powerful about Act 2 of Flint is Family, that it's about going back to land. And it's about going back to land that people have a sense of history with. The other ways that land appears is in the place where an industrial site or the hospital in Braddock used to be. And so it's a space of absence and a space of memory. It takes me back to Dolores Hayden's idea of landscape as a storehouse for memory. And then if you tear things down, part of what you're doing is erasing that memory. And part of what Frazier is trying to do is say, let's not erase it, let's capture it, let's recognize what's there. Does that help? Am I getting to your question? Okay, cool.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question also circles back to the topic of nostalgia. And specifically, I'm really interested in the medium of photography. So also thank you for introducing me to Frazier's practice, which I didn't know. It sounds like I have a very heavy book to look forward to.
Yes.
But I'm really curious about
Start with her website.
So I'm really curious about the decision to work with black and white photography in terms of representations of the past and time. It seems like black and white photography is a little bit more ambiguous in terms of like dating a photo and what's happening. So I'm curious about what significance does that play in terms of your reading?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't think I have a good answer for it now. She has written about this. So at the back of each of these books, there are some essays and things and interviews that she's done. And I know she's talked about that. And to be honest, I don't remember exactly what she said. I'll tell you my take on it. And this actually goes back to the work that John and I did on reading work, where we asked students, in the book, why would somebody take a black and white photo when color is, if I want to do black and white on my phone, I have to work at it, right? And it is in part about that reference to the past and about timelessness. And it, when I first started thinking about this, I was thinking about, I'm one of the older people in the room, so many of you don't remember this, but I remember being in elementary school and seeing film strips, like little documentary films. They were always black and white, and they were almost always talking about history. And it's like, so it puts something in the past to do it that way. And yet, so many of the photos in Frazier's books are current. Now, there are many more color photos in Flint is Family. And the Woman of Steel project, it's kind of in between. Like I don't think any of the photos that I've seen from that project are color photos, but then she does that cyanotype thing to add color to it, but to add monochrome color to it. So it's a great question, and I think it taps into the ways we think about history and the ways we think about historic photographs, and is in some ways laying a claim to that, yet without... There is not a place in any of these books where she talks about how great that industrial work was and how devastating it was for people to lose it, which is what you see in a lot of the work by especially white writers. She just doesn't do that. And I think in many ways the playwrights skip that as well.
So I really liked your talk. I was looking forward to it, and you exceeded my expectations, so brava. But I'm listening to you talk about nostalgia, and not to make it all about me, but so I come from a coal mining family. There's no nostalgia there. I mean, so I wonder if that varies by industry, because I grew up, I went to a coal mine with my children in Canada somewhere. Sorry to my Canadian colleagues, I don't remember where it was. But I brought a lump of coal back from my dad, and I gave it to him, and he said, "I'm not taking that." And I said, "Why?" He said, I spent my whole life trying to get out of going into the coal mines. I'm not taking that. You can have it. And I heard stories about, my dad joined the military because he said to his father when he graduated high school, "Pop, I want to go to college." And my grandfather said, "What college? There's no money for college. You got two choices. You go to the mines, you go to the military." He went to the military. And I remember asking my uncles, because I hear these stories about my uncles coming out of the coal mines, and they were covered in coal dust. And all you could see were their eyes and their lips. And, the stories about that, and them just saying how awful it was. And I have an uncle who was 19, and he was killed in a coal mining accident. And so I've heard all my life how shitty this work was. So when I hear about nostalgia, I'm thinking, like, nobody I know in northeastern Pennsylvania in anthracite waxes nostalgia. I mean, all the Facebook groups I'm on, they're all like, people talk about white privilege. This was not privilege. Like, this was awful. We suffered. This was terrible. So I wonder, like, who's nostalgic? Who's the audience for that? What's the industry? Because I don't hear it. Yeah. At least in anthracite, I don't hear that.
So I don't know that I would say that it's industry specific, because there are people talking about coal mining in nostalgic ways. And what they talk about, they don't erase all those hardships that your uncles and father talked about. What they hold on to is the idea that we did work that mattered. We did work that was valued in the world. But I'm not sure how we draw the line between those, because it's about what we lost, and that we don't have that anymore, and that it's a struggle for workers to find that. And so I read it as nostalgia because it's a looking at the past for a quality of life, and it's often not about the conditions of the work itself. Because steel workers would say the same thing that people would say about coal mining. It was hard, it was dangerous, it was dirty, it was loud, it was a miserable job. And they often, with all of that, will have a critique of capitalism and all of the things that happen with it. And yet, there is still that sense that there was work available that could give us an identity, that could give us meaning in life, that was stable, that was, not always well paid, but eventually, for many industrial workers, was well paid. So there are all kinds of parts of that that people look back on. And it's rarely a pure nostalgia in the sense that it's only nostalgia. There's always a mixed story with that. The difference is that you almost never see in any of the work of these black artists that idea. There's a little of it in Dominique Morisseau's Skeleton Crew, where there's the young woman who's working in the auto plant who gives a speech at some point about what being an auto worker means to her. And so you get that sense. But because it's so often about something that is lost and in the past, that's why I identify it as nostalgia, because it's a sense of loss of that.
Okay, I guess we define nostalgia differently.
And I would just say there's a whole body of research on nostalgia that talks about different variations of it, different uses of it. Should we ever accept nostalgia as a good thing? Should we always see nostalgia as a sort of false consciousness? Huge debates about all of this. But there is a sense of part of what happens when people look back at what was lost with industrial jobs is a sense of the difference between what workers could have then and what workers can have now. And that the conditions of work now do not allow pride in work, do not allow a sense of identity, do not create the kinds of solidarities that we often identify with industrial work. A great example of that comes from a British scholar named Linda McDowell, who has, Valerie Walkerdine, who has done a project talking with young men who got kicked out of the coal mines in the 1980s and had to go do things like work at grocery stores. And they talk about the shame of being seen in public putting boxes of cereal on the shelf, because that's not what a man should do. So that's part of what it's tied up in.
I'm not convinced, but that's okay. We could talk about it over a beer.
We're academics. We're not, we never fully convince each other.
I don't have I was sort of hesitant to ask a question because I'm a bit tired, so I'm trying to put it into a question, but maybe tied to that, I was really struck by when you were talking earlier around the sort of patchwork of labor, putting, like driving the school bus, then, like an informal kind of, I presume, like hair study, then also creative work. And I was thinking around, with a lot of like precarity movements, like different precarious movements, there's things around, the recognition of the different sort of social value attributed to different things within a shared, idea, or shared like precarious position or so. But with putting in this patchwork, I also wonder how that shifts with this sort of changed meaning of work, or rather like this contested sort of against erasure also in terms of having another formulation of how we think of work, but then also the social value attributed to that within this different sort of frame. Again, a bit too tired to put this in a coherent thing, but if that made sense to you.
I think so. Let me try to answer, and this kind of takes us far away from this work, but I think I've been having conversations with several of you about things like, Nancy's work on freelancing, for example, taps into this, that we see a lot of young people today whose expectations of their work life is not what it was for even my generation, where, the idea was you would get a job and you would work at that job for most of your life and it would become part of your identity. It's much harder for a lot of young people, and part of what we're seeing is, I think, a kind of investment in this DIY version. Let me make my own patchwork of things, often. Sometimes because I don't have a choice. If I want to be a journalist, I have to be a freelancer. But also because I can't get a full-time job anyway, or I can't get a full-time job that I want. that's going to give me any sense of that. It goes back to that sense of what does work mean. I mean, one of the arguments in the Half-Life of Deindustrialization book is that work has changed in ways that make the social and psychological benefits of work out of reach. But we don't see people giving up on trying to find meaning in their lives. And we don't even see people necessarily giving up on hoping that work will be one of the ways they do that. What we're seeing, I think, is people being willing to accept lousy working conditions and greater levels of exploitation and a lack of solidarity in order to get that sense of meaning, which I find kind of scary and sad. As I've said to some of you, I'm preparing a first-year seminar for students at my university in the fall on work that is in part, and I really want to get students thinking about, well, what are your expectations of work? What are you looking for? What are the social and economic forces that are going to shape what your work life is about? Because I think we need to be thinking more critically about this. Am I getting, Sarah, at all what you were thinking about?
Yeah, maybe perhaps also like with the other points of resistance from this sort of erasure, or rather, yeah, the sort of points of resistance of this like alternative deindustrial imaginary as well, with tied in with this sort of different valuation.
Yes. Yeah, that the idea that Shay Cobb is a great example. I'm going to drive the bus, but I'm also, and because she defines cutting hair as an artistic and creative activity, I'm also going to cut people's hair and provide a service, but I'm going to do it in my home where I have control over that labor. And then I'm going to write songs, and I'm going to write poems, and I'm going to help put together poetry slams, and I'm going to find meaning there. Not that she actually talks about finding meaning in the school bus driving too. You were talking about the beautiful photo of her in the bus, and she talks about the pleasure of interacting with the children every day and what a great thing that is. But she also recognizes the ways that the only way she can survive is patching all of those things together. And some of it is the only way she can do the creative work is to do the other work. That there's a trade-off that people have to make. And I think that's becoming more and more common.
I guess this is where we have to stop. Thank you so much, Sherry, for giving us this insight into your work and how this older project kind of reaches out into the new project. Please let us give a hand again for Sherry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
And I guess we're in for our exciting membership meeting, right?
Yes, we have 15 minutes. We have 10 to 15 minute break, and then all BAA members will meet here again, and everybody else can come back for food at 7:15 to 7:30, and we can mingle and continue conversations.